Good morning. Just going to give it another little bit here for participants in the webinar to join us this morning, and then we will get going. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Kendra Jolly. I am the Partnership and Grants Coordinator with the Invasive Species Center. I would very much like to thank you for joining us today for our Invasive Phragmites focused webinar on developing your budget and understanding the in-kind contributions for the Invasive Phragmites Control Fund. We very much want to thank you for your understanding and having the event rescheduled and joining us this morning. We're very happy that you're able to do so. Just a couple of reminders for you. If you have any questions as we're going throughout the webinar this morning, please do add them to the Q&A box, not to the chat. I'll answer the questions as I can as we're moving through. We're also going to have the opportunity to answer questions live at the end of the webinar if there's any questions remaining, or if there are questions that I feel would benefit everyone to hear the answer to. With that as well, the webinar is also going to be recorded and posted to our YouTube page. So if you'd like to reference it at a later date, you're able to go back and do so, and you're able to share with any colleagues or partners that you want to share the information with. So with that being said, I'm going to hand things over to Colin Casson, our policy manager here at the ISD, and he's going to take us through the webinar today.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, Kendra. Okay, I think we're good to go. I'm sharing cover slide here. So Kendra, holler at me if I'm not sharing. Yeah, there we go. Looks like the right page.
You're good.
Okay, here we go. Happy Friday before the long weekend. Thank you, Kendra, for the welcome. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Apologies for the reschedule. Our Zoom account is very popular these days. So we are recording today's session. So if you're watching this in the future on our YouTube channel, appreciate you tuning in as well. As Kendra noted, the benefit of being here live is you're able to chime in with questions throughout the presentation. So please feel free to chime in at any point. And as Kendra noted, this is the second of a kind of two-part series of webinars surrounded the Invasive Phragmites Control Fund. We're really pleased to be able to deliver the fund again this year. This would mark our fifth year working in collaboration with our partners at the Green Shovels Collaborative. So really pleased to be able to do that, and really appreciative of all the work that's been supported and delivered through Frag Fund recipients for the last few years. So we're really excited about this as an opportunity. Our first webinar really focused on Frag Fund overview. What is the fund? What projects are we looking for? How do we define a really strong project and help proponents connect in nicely with the reviewers, what they're looking for and what the criteria of project selection would be. And last year we did a similar webinar, just the one approach. And then, some of the feedback we've taken away is just that budget creation piece, and really about in-kind contribution and assessing what is it that I as a proponent am bringing to the table and how do I quantify that well. That was an area of need that was expressed by a number of proponents last year. So this is a webinar that we're trying to do to respond to that feedback. And appreciate the feedback from anybody on the call or any proponent last year or recipient last year. We treat this as an iterative process. We are trying to do nothing but improve year over year. And I think we have in the 5 years we've delivered the funds. So appreciate your patience with it. And again, always looking to mine good ideas to make this funding program the best it can be and connect best with the local fragging action that's happening out there. So without further ado, let's jump into let's talk budgets and let's talk in-kind contributions. I assume you know about Phragmites if you're considering a frag fund proposal, so we can pass on this today. But just to underscore the key point here, which is really Phragmites, we're approaching Phragmites as an issue from a wide issue set. Yes, it is ecologically critically important, strong links to species at risk and other flora and fauna implications as well. Obviously, economically really important too, especially for our municipal partners. Having to do enhanced roadside ditching is just a great example of a really actionable cost that's incurred because of this invasive plant. Culturally really important too. Outcompetes other native species that are critical, really strong competitor in terms of wild rice habitat and other kind of culturally linked and culturally important assets too. Beach access impediment, you name it. I think if you're tuning in today, I think those messages are well received and understood. And so just a little bit of context on why are we looking for a budget and what's the importance, just to underscore as well. The Frag Fund is a pretty, it goes from smaller project support. This year we're looking for projects that are at least $2,500, all the way up to those kind of well integrated exceptional projects that we're supporting up to $50,000. There's a really wide diversity of experience in terms of submitting and writing grants. So really we want to make sure that this is an opportunity for us to set level a little bit for all proponents or all prospective proponents. And so, just bit of budget 101. It's the most important component of your document, arguably. And some reviewers review in different ways, but some will just flip straight to the budget and say, that what your budget says your project is actually what your project is. And then they'll flip to the front half of the proposal and evaluate, how are you tying into broader themes and fund priorities. But really, it's a quick and easy way for reviewers to understand just what is this project and where are you placing your greatest emphasis. So I can't overstate its importance in terms of defining a project and helping a reviewer quickly understand what is it this group is looking to action. And our review teams do score I think one of the pieces of feedback and questions we get is, well, if I trim this budget line down a little bit, does that make it more competitive? And I just want to make the point that really we're looking and assessing for projects that are based on realistic outcomes. Not how few dollars are you looking for, but really just how realistic is it that you can achieve these outcomes based on what you either have coming from other supporters or what you're looking for from the Frag Fund. So I would encourage you, I think the fund is inherently looking to support as much work and as great of outcome set as we could across the whole province of Ontario. But of course, we're really not trying to look to haggle anybody down in terms of how, what is it that you're looking for. Would encourage you to think about what do you need to meet those objectives and make sure that it reflects that. I think it's a community, obviously, of fraggers out there that deliver value kind of inherently. We're all very kind of, creative solution focus, and that kind of is obviously reflected in our budgets. But just want to make the point that we're really assessing here on how realistic this is, not how inexpensive some of these projects can be. And so sometimes, just try and find that delicate balance. But I understand as well from, there's a reasonable range out there, and there's also some folks who are expanding their scope and abilities a little bit and trying to do and implement new work with that they may not have the same level of experience implementing those kinds of control techniques or those same approaches in the past. So we just encourage you to do your best to make reasonable judgments, and when possible, just articulate rationale. We try and created this proposal as flexible as possible, and it gives everyone a chance to kind of explain their thinking wherever possible. And so as long as numbers are reasonable and there's rationale provided, it helps us make sure. I wish it was more of an iterative process where we could have reviewers communicating more directly with proponents, but obviously, for a variety of reasons, that's a little more challenging. So this is our one-stop opportunity here to get from proponents a little bit of insight when you're doing something that's either new to you or perhaps a little bit more novel of an approach or technique. Give us as much documentation as you possibly can. Help us understand, especially within the scope of the budget, where some of these assumptions are made and where they're coming from. As long as they're reasonable, there's no concern from the review team's perspective. A bit of a new approach for this year is we are installing a one-to-one contribution in-kind match requirement. The point of this webinar is to articulate how groups, my perspective from running this fund and other funds in the past is that some groups maybe undervalue what they're bringing to the table, or maybe just don't think about those contributions and assessing them in that really comprehensive fashion. And it's an important piece of the project because every, piece of equipment that exists and that has a depreciation because it's used on that project, or every little bit of additional staff time or oversight or project guidance, those are all really important contributions. The obvious ones in terms of the volunteer capacity and support are critically important as well. But in past applications, we've seen those to be a little bit under considered, I think. And we respect totally the really important and comprehensive contributions that fraggers are out there making. So We hope that the one-to-one match is not a barrier and would encourage anyone who does see it as a barrier to reach out, to help communicate with us, and we can help work with you together to help make sure that you're finding your path to the one-to-one match. It's not installed as a way of keeping anyone out, and we do respect the fact that it can be hard for some groups to find that. And so we want to work with you to try and make that possible and not a barrier to stop any good proposal from coming into the Frag Fund this year or any year. So with a one-to-one match as a combination, it's not just cash, but it's also those kind of truer in-kind voluntary type contributions. And really that's the focus of today's webinar, is helping people understand what is that. I'm not familiar with that, or I know different funders perceive in-kind contributions in different ways. So we're hoping here to help just give a little bit more guidance to proponents on what that looks like. So in kind, like I say, could be cash. Doesn't need to be just true non-monetary resources, but of course those are included and they are weighted equally. We just take those two numbers and add them together. So a project that's coming in that has a full match contribution of cash is not a stronger project inherently than a project that's coming in that's just say just, but it's not just exclusively volunteer time donation, and that is the in-kind contribution on a different project. Those are both excellent projects and they're the right fit for the proponent, and we don't pass any judgment on those. We just look at adding those two numbers together, and it's okay if you don't have any existing cash from other sources. That's not a concern from a reviewer perspective. Again, weighted equally entirely. And so we do understand, this time of year, especially a little bit earlier as well, is that sometimes funders don't give you notice until the project is we're midway into the field season here. So would encourage you to indicate as well just what is the level of security that you feel. And that's okay if you don't have a firm and final contribution agreement from another funder. That's okay, and that's not a concern. We don't, but we are asking folks to indicate what is the level of security on that within the budget table. So if you've got the money and you've got a signed agreement and there is another funder bringing money to the table, that's lovely. Just indicate that if you would. If you just have simply put in an application to another funder and have not heard back yes or no either way, that's no problem either. So just if you could indicate level of security, it helps us just understand where the project stands as well. Some types of in-kind contributions, which really is the focus of the conversation today. We're looking to support a really wide array of in-kind contributions and encourage all proponents to really understand what is it that they're bringing to the table that makes the project viable. But basically, it's any contribution that a proponent is making that otherwise, if not contributed, would not have the project proceed. And so that can look like jobs, that can look like managers or coordinators or even technicians or administration. Maybe there's project administration or bookkeeping staff that are working on the project, but a little bit more removed from on the ground. Those are still important contributions that make the project happen and viable. So I would encourage you to think about those as maybe sometimes under-reflected in-kind contributions. Of course, this is an obvious one, but if there's contractors working directly on the project, that's really important. Usually those are captured, but just like to state it as well. Volunteers as well, obviously many of the Frag Fund projects, especially at the kind of medium level, tend to be volunteer-led and initiative, and it's really important stewardship work. So we do encourage you to make sure that you're capturing all of that time and all of those many contributions as best you can. Equipment as well, be it little things like office supplies, specialized machinery, personal protective equipment, vehicles, all sorts of little components. We'll talk a little bit more about how to assess those in a few minutes, but please do make sure that you're providing an assessment on all the many contributions you're making in that space. Professional services as well. Sometimes exterior groups or external groups are supporting projects either on communications or bookkeeping support, things like that. So those are helpful as well. And again, I always go back to, would the project proceed if that support wasn't provided? If yes, then it's just looking for that. I think that's a good primary filter for you to think through. And then sometimes there's the miscellaneous pieces. Maybe it's frag disposal and plant material disposal. Maybe it's permits as well and time for applying for permits, things like that. And little bits and pieces like postage and other fees also add up too. So I'd encourage you just to kind of think about that in terms of the broad and global set of what you're looking for. So to put a little bit more information, and again, the applicant guidebook really does kind of help people understand, how should some of the thinking be guided here, but we want to just to help people understand with a little more specificity. Salaries and human resources. So those could be actual or wage costs. It's always a good idea to include any mandatory employer costs as well. So if you want to use like a 13% or even 15%, just to factor that in beyond, wages that would be dispersed, that's a very reasonable kind of standard approach. Excuse me. So anyone who's working on the project at any level, either direct involvement, they're out there, removing biomass, mapping frag, or if it's a little bit more removed but critically important to the project happening, would encourage you to think about those as either budget lines on your fund, or of course in kind if you're not looking for specifically resources for those people. Just to note, because we've got a question a couple times, just please do make sure that this is treated as separately. We have a different funding program that funds all species, but not frag, through the Invasive Species Action Fund, which closed a little while ago, a few weeks back. So we just encourage you to make sure that there's kind of no redundancy between projects, if you don't mind, please. Because sometimes there are opponents that are submitting projects that have links, even though the other fund is created for not for frag, but there's a little bit of transferable time there with staffing. So just again, would encourage you to treat these as very distinct and separate. Excuse me, sorry. Professional and technical services or contracts, what could those look like? They could look like consulting fees if you're looking for an external contractor to do some of the management or even strategy development or mapping work as well. Any technical expert that's directly related to the funding project. So again, that could be, the people doing the control work or the mapping work. It could be people who are a little bit farther afield, be they comms professionals, lawyers, indigenous elders providing insights as well. So it's a pretty broad perspective on that, but just would encourage people to think, because sometimes we think about those who are doing the frag control work themselves, but maybe we underappreciate those that are still critically important and make the project viable, but might not be explicitly requiring support through ISAF. But would encourage you to think about those as really important in-kind contributions that are being made to the project. Volunteer hours, of course, is usually well reflected, but just want to underscore it's an important piece as well. So those are just the hours of time that any volunteer to your organization or to your broader cause is using to support a project. So the hourly wage is a conversation and a question we have often. Would encourage you to think about that in whatever way you think is appropriate. How much would it cost you to hire out an additional technician to do that role? I think that's usually a reasonable way to frame it. And again, because if you're going outside of the standard scope there of, let's say, arguably $20 an hour or so, we just encourage you to document it, because sometimes volunteers are more specialized and they're coming from a different skill set that might justify a different number, perhaps an increased number from that, or conversely a little bit lower. So we just encourage you to kind of articulate that within the scope of your budget. Travel and subsistence costs, anything that you think is reasonable that are kind of direct out of pocket fees that either your organization's perhaps incurring or maybe volunteers might be incurring. Just want to make sure that those are captured because they're important and they make the project viable as well. Equipment, materials, and supplies. So anything that's purchased, donated, it could be new, it could be used, any of those materials. One question we often get too is, okay, we've got shovels from last year's project. They were funded by a different funder. Are we looking at basically taking the receipts and figuring out and putting those against this project? I think there's reasonable people would have different approaches to that. So we're happy to accept kind of any, reasonable approach. A good way to address that directly would be something like, if you're trying to amortize a piece of equipment over, let's say you're projecting it's going to be useful for 3 or 5 years, depending on the equipment. We'll just consider you take and divide that original purchase price and spread it out over a few years. So we see that with especially higher cost tools, usually things beyond like the hand tools and small tools piece. Sometimes it's vehicle access. Sometimes it can be more specialized equipment as well if you're using a different piece of equipment. So I think the main idea and takeaway here is just make sure that philosophically somehow those costs are addressed and being reflected in those in-kind contributions. So if, again, I think we're looking to support any reasonable, well-articulated and justified approach. So would encourage you to think about just what do you think is reasonable, but usually that amortized approach tends to be a really effective and well-received approach from past applicants as well. Sometimes overlooked would be software or new technologies and databases. So that could be like, what is your ArcGIS or your Esri license costing you every year? And that's a reasonable cost, especially if frag mapping is a part of your project. Of course, it would be reasonable to make sure that that's reflected in a good, strong budget and a comprehensive budget as well. So just like to call that out because I think it's often underutilized and underthought of. And then sometimes, I mean, it takes effort to disseminate those results. So I encourage you just to think about that too. It could be direct costs in terms of salary and HR and some of those costs there, but it could be others as well. Maybe doing presentation, convening an open house evening, things like that. Those are just important components of projects that create really strong and effective projects. But sometimes we find are just a little bit underthought of in terms of making sure that's work that's done and it's critically important to the project. So make sure you reflect it in the budget. Another small piece as well, but often overlooked, is just the use of facilities. So maybe that's one of your partners on the project allowing or donating their meeting space as well. Maybe they're making use of a boardroom or a community center. Those are just really important contributions that do add up. So we encourage people to make sure that they're reflecting those in the projects as well. So a little bit of guidance on the budget. It's very similar budget if you're familiar with the Frag Fund from last year or the the Invasive Species Action Fund. So a really similar budget template here, and what we're looking for, I'll kind of walk you through the actual template in a second here, is under the Good Grants platform, which hopefully you've already had access to and started a project under. You can pull up within your application, obviously you've got these different tabs. You've got a budget table tab as well across the top. So if you select that, and I'm sure many people here would have already seen this, you'll see this tab here. And it's just a simple form. It's a little bit easier for us to manage on the back end than previous frag fund cycles. So appreciate you working with a slightly different version of this, but what we're looking to do here is ask you to try and think of your project in preset buckets or spending categories. So salaries and human resources, travel and accommodation, professional or contractor services, equipment and supplies for purchase, equipment and supplies for rental, and project administration. And these categories help us, and we understand they're not necessarily perfect. Some people see their projects as fitting into other categories as well. Would encourage you to use these categories wherever it's possible and add rows, but also understand that maybe your project is unique and has elements that perhaps don't fit well into this. So would encourage you to add other columns without those categories if required. And of course, articulate the rationale if you could. And so we're looking for in these in a well thought out, well completed budget. Sorry. So here's an example here. It's just a fictitious example, but similar project to what we would have seen from the Invasive Species Action Fund. But basically, we kind of ran through these categories here. We've got a salaries and human resources line here. So there's a project coordinator. They've kind of articulated what is it that the project coordinator is going to need. They're going to need about 20 hours at $25 an hour. Let's argue that cost would include things like MERCs, but you may want to articulate that if I was doing this one again. And then, so those multiply out to $500. So they're looking for $500 from the Frag Fund. But they've got another funder, the Parks and Community Fund, who's willing to chip in some additional time because all of that work, the $500 doesn't cover the full project scope. So they found another $700 from another funder. And then they're also bringing an additional in-kind contribution out of, let's say, this municipality's budget of $1,250. And so those numbers can add together here to kind of give the total the total set there. So they're looking for $500. They're bringing $700 to the table. And so these numbers, cash and in kind, yeah, okay. So that would be one salaries and human resources. Now, maybe this project isn't done exclusively by a project coordinator. Maybe there's some field technicians in there, and if that's the case, would encourage you to hit the add row button on the bottom, and you can throw in a few more salaries and human resources lines here, and start to articulate them out on a one-by-one basis. So maybe there's you've got the project coordinator covered. Maybe there's that field, those 3 field technicians that are going to be involved in implementing the project. Would encourage you to add additional lines for those. And we've seen other really good projects that have completed all of their salaries and human resources by just adding, hitting enter, and having project coordinator in that cell, and then in the same cell below, maybe those field technicians, or maybe I don't know, wetland ecologist or something like that. So, it's to each their own. However you think it fits your project and describes your project best and looks cleanest and easiest to understand, I'd say go for that. So if you want to bundle 3 different salary people, or human resources lines within one cell, that's okay. No concern whatsoever. Just make sure that this number sums to whatever the 2 or 3 different people would be there. So that's how you might fill out a salaries in HR. Here they've got a line for travel and accommodations as well. They're bringing to the table $75, again, thanks to another funder, the Parks and Community Fund. They're not chipping in anything in kind, and they're also not looking for anything from the Frag Fund to support that. So that's a nice and clean and easy $75, and then that's being leveraged against their overall in kind. So professional contractor services, this is something they're looking for money from the Frag Fund for, $2,000 for somebody to treat or maybe do some mapping, or removal of Phragmites at the site here. So they're looking for $2,000, and they don't have another funder to support that project. That's why those cells are empty. Let's say they're also looking for a tablet to do some post treatment monitoring. So maybe they need some, a cheap tablet to do some monitoring work on. So they're looking for that because they don't have another funder to cover that piece. They're looking for $130. Or sorry, maybe they do have another funder and they are that funder and they're bringing $600 there. So maybe it is a $730 tablet. So they're looking for just a little bit of a top up from the Frag Fund money to cover off that, but another funder maybe in-house, they've already got some internal budget to that. A few other examples here they're looking for a trailer to remove some of that biomass that they've perhaps maybe they followed the best management practices guide and they've done a treatment, and now they're removing some of that dead biomass from a previous year at an adjacent site, perhaps because they're looking to stimulate regrowth from the native plant community that might be hanging on still. And so $80 to rent that trailer. And they're not looking for any money out of this from the Frag Fund because they've already got the Parks and Community Fund that's sponsoring that. Admin costs, there is a hard cap of up to 10%, so it would encourage you to think about what is it that you really need. In terms of what are admin costs, sometimes we do get questions about, does the sound admin? We have a little bit of guidance in the document in terms of what those costs include. They would include things like bookkeeper fees, stamps, and other lines that are kind of similar to that. So maybe some permitting fees, things like that. So those kind of small, miscellaneous but important pieces of a project, we are able to cap it at 10% of what you're looking for from the Frag Fund. So do please make use of that because it's important, and that's the kind of budget line that helps these projects happen. So please make use of that category if needed. And with that in mind, I think that's kind of a broad and quick overview of what are in-kind contributions, what are some of those maybe underreported pieces that would help define a really good and comprehensive project. So I would encourage you to make sure, do your best to think through what is it that us and our partners on a project are bringing to the table that if not contributed otherwise, this project wouldn't happen or wouldn't happen in the same way. So please do feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Kendra's contact info, you know how to find her there. And just another reminder before we jump into some questions here, the due date's May 30th. We did extend a couple other funds recently. This fund doesn't have that same extension ability on it because we really need to get those proponent letters out to the recipients in hand. So May 30th, the end of this month, the end of May, is the deadline here. So appreciate, there's still 13 days left before those submissions are due. So I would encourage you to reach out anytime between now and then, if you have any questions and we can be useful. So with that in mind, Kendra, I think I see a couple questions. I think you've got through a couple of them too there. So, but yeah, wanna jump in here and we can go through a few remaining questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Colin. So I was able to address a couple of those for us. One question did come in. Our volunteers contribute their time and equipment, such as brush cutters. Is it reasonable for us to estimate based on what it would be to cost what it would cost to rent the equipment? So
Yeah, I
volunteers are
think that's
supplying the
very
equipment.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. I think no reviewer would ever have any concern about that. Maybe just articulating that in the notes would give you the strongest link there. An alternative approach for anyone else thinking about that would just be maybe what is the cost of the equipment and a depreciation value. Sometimes there's really specialized equipment that you can only buy and you can't rent. So in that scenario, I think as you propose, it's the right solution for it, especially if just reasonably articulated there, but it sounds totally reasonable in the two sentences of your question there. But for other scenarios, maybe where it's specialized equipment not available for rent, an alternative approach there might just be that this is the purchase cost, this is the anticipated timeline of it. We had to purchase it with some other funding, but just want to make sure that that's captured on your proposal too. So we're taking the depreciation value of it and saying it's spread out over 5 years, let's say, and taking 1/5 every year and putting that on the project as an in-kind. I think that'd be an alternative approach, but I think your approach for this is right.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Our next and only question at the moment is if staff are being certified as herbicide applicators as part of the application, would that go under human resources or professional services?
I think it's more professional services because I think you're looking at the training fee specifically there. So, but I guess maybe you could see it either way. So I guess maybe to interpret the question as the fee that it would cost to have them trained, that sounds to me like a professional service. But if you're thinking about this more as, well, it also costs us time to send them to that training. So also want to make sure that their time and maybe travel, if it's required, would be incorporated within that. I might look to that um, that might it'd be messy in a budget to split it out on two lines. So I'd suggest, just make your best judgment in that scenario, Garrett, depending on how you think it's going to be split. If you're thinking about it in a two-pronged approach, you're looking at the time and you're looking at just the course fees as well. I think both are reasonable costs to include. Um, you may want to be thoughtful about are you attributing that entire bill to this so I philosophically no concern about including it. It's a great idea, it should be included. um it may be perceived as a bit much if you put the full bill on this project. Maybe they're similar to that kind of depreciating approach to equipment. You may want to consider, well, we expect that they're going to do two different jobs this year, thus we're only putting 50% of it on it. I think there's reasonable ways to explain it either way, and I don't think any reasonable reviewer, if you articulated the rationale why you put 100% of that on this project, is because it's your flagship biggest project, the only project you're engaging on Frag this year, and that's why we're putting 100% of the cost on it. I think that's reasonable as long as you would articulate it. But if you have a little bit of wiggle room on your one-to-one and you're already meeting it in other ways, you may want to consider scaling that back a little bit and saying, well, we're doing two projects, so thus 50% is amortized to this project. So again, I think there's different reasonable ways to approach it. Just would encourage you to articulate it well within the budget table itself.
Excellent. Thanks, Colin. Looks like those are the only questions that we have. Um, of course, if anyone else has any other questions that they would like to address after the webinar, because we are wrapping a little bit early, feel free to reach out to myself and I'll be happy to get those answered for you, or get you in touch with the correct person who can provide those answers.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Kendra. Thank you to everybody for your interest in submitting to the fund this year. Really exciting information to come soon in terms of next steps on the fund as well. So keep your ears tuned. But again, appreciate your responsiveness to that May 30th deadline because it's coming up quick. So best of luck. And as Kendra says, please reach out.
Yes,
Thanks,
excellent.
Andrew.
Thank you so much and enjoy your upcoming long weekend, everyone. Thanks, Colin.